test on YouTube if we are indeed live. If anyone in YouTube land can tell me if we are live, that would be wonderful. But I'm also going to check on my phone now on YouTube. So if you just type in the chat box, wherever you're from, or maybe I'm just talking to myself, who knows?
You're talking to me, Luke. It's fine.
That's true. I'm also talking to Tim.
We'll have a good time, even if we're just in the void.
Oh, we are on. I can see myself. So we're all good. And there are already 20 of us, apparently. So if you want to type your name in the chat box and where you're from, my IT technician, Agat, has told me that we are live. So that's great. Everyone, welcome to the first Sherlock Pages live. I'm going to do a sort of formal opening in 4 minutes. I'm going to start on the dot. But if you just want to be typing in the chat box where you're from, good to see someone from Derbyshire, Leamington Spa, Devon. I wonder who's going to be the most exotic, although we are a little bit by time zones. So let's see. And Tim, you're joining us from
Cornwall.
Cornwall, of course.
Yeah, of course. Well, it could have been Ireland. It could have been Ireland. It is Cornwall. It is Cornwall. Yeah.
Hold on. I think we have a winner. Well, we have Tennessee. We have Worcester. Ohio. Wonderful. It'll be really interesting to see how many people join. I think we've got 37 now. It's really astonishing to me what you can do on the internet and connect people. I find that Sherlock Pages, every week someone comes in and says, this shop, like these books, are my taste, and I can't really describe what that taste is, but it's landscape, history, nature. I do like reading fiction, but I also like reading non-fiction, and they've got the same taste as this shop. So it's really nice, and I feel like now, as bad as the internet can be, it also can bring some good because it can kind of bring the same people together. So
isn't it that thing when you go into somebody's house and you kind of gravitate to the bookshelves, and there's always that little kind of thrill where you see a book that you've read and you think, surely I'm the only person in the world to have read whatever it is. And then you look, and then there's another one and another one. And then it makes sense if it's all non-fiction nature books, but then you swing to the novels and like, weird, they also like whoever else it is. And there's just that lovely little feeling. I've not been to the shop in person, but I definitely get the sense that anyone walking through the door of the shop who has that kind of taste in books would have that feeling.
We'll have to get you to drop by at some point, but I imagine you'll have read quite a lot of them. We do get customers saying, I've read that, but we are always bringing in fresh stock. So
that's quite nice. I mean, that's the thing to do, loitering in bookshops, to just go, yeah, good one, and then I'm terrible for buying books. Not terrible, it's good for booksellers. I'm good for buying books I've already got, because I think I'm not quite sure where that one is. I haven't seen that one for a while. I'll get it again.
These are the people we rely on, or the people who love books so much that they buy them to then gift on to others, which I get quite.
Yeah. So Kathleen Jamie's Cairn, which I'm sure you have in the shop. I think I've probably bought 7 or 8 of them so far.
Categorize that one. We found. So I think it's in our kind of like environmental philosophy and thinking section, because it's quite thoughtful at some points. Okay, I think we can formally get underway. There's 65 of us. I'm sure the numbers will rise. Thank you, everyone who's introducing yourselves. It is giving me a really good appreciation for who is able to join. And the real star of the show behind the scenes, sorry, Tim, Kerry Shepherd, who doesn't go on the socials because she likes to stay behind the scenes, but Kerry is in the comments, and I'm sure we'll be looking at everything that you're writing. So actually today we've already got quite a lot of questions, Tim. So for everyone, Tim, do you just want to say hello to the assembled?
Everyone, lovely to be here. Thanks for having me, Luke, and thanks everyone else for coming along. This is great. Thank you.
I really appreciate it. And Tim is down in his homeland in Cornwall. And as I was saying, we have quite a lot of questions. So what I'm going to try and do is get through as many questions as we can whilst having good, thorough answers. But if you do want to drop comments and questions in the chat box, I will try and get to them. Apologies if I don't in advance. This is going to be difficult to manage, and I'm learning as much as you guys are. But Tim, just to start with, I wanted to kind of set the scene for you as a writer. If you could tell us what is intimated a little bit in the book about, you're a young man growing up in Cornwall, and you are working summer jobs, I'm getting the impression, bringing in some of that tourist money into your pocket and then going off traveling. How did it evolve that you became a writer from those circumstances? What were some of the moments that made it click for you that I want to be a writer, and this love of literature and really getting into it?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there isn't really an answer to that because it had always been there. I was always writing from primary school onwards and all the way through secondary school. And I think like lots of people who end up writing, they just kind of know it's just what they do. They write. What I didn't entirely know is what it was I should be writing or what it was I really wanted to write. So I was a chef. I didn't go to university straight out of school. I trained as a chef. I was working as a chef, and I would be doing kind of split shifts. You do a lunchtime shift, and I'd come home and batter out a really bad sub Ernest Hemingway short story, and then go back to the kitchen at 6 o'clock. So I was doing that, and there are 3 dead novels in a bottom drawer somewhere as well that I kind of churned my way through. And I discovered travel writing in my late teens. So this is sort of the end of the 90s. There'd been this massive boom in travel writing that had gone on from the 1970s right the way through the 80s and the 90s. So it's writers like Bruce Chatwin, Colin Thubron, and slightly later generation, it's Sarah Wheeler, William Dalrymple, Philip Marsden, and so on. So I kind of discovered that writing and loved it, and was also starting to go traveling, having my winters off from work because a lot of the restaurants here would lay people off at the end of September. And if you were actually a trained qualified chef, they loved you if you said you didn't want a full-time job. You wanted to start at Easter and leave in October. That was great. You could just, I could come home from a winter away in Southeast Asia or wherever it was and be in a job the next day. And so I did that for a good number of years. So I was still writing, and I had kind of gravitated towards the travel writing in my own reading, and also in what I was starting to try and do. But I didn't really know how to get there, how to do it. I did have an attempt at writing a travel book about Indonesia when I was about 24, 25. And that was the first one I seriously tried to kind of send out to agents and publishers, and generally speaking didn't get any response. It's got a couple of sort of, yes, this is okay, but travel writing was sort of going off the boil at that point. Nature writing, which I hadn't realized, the nature writing was rising in the background within the UK publishing scene. This was sort of 2005 maybe. So that kind of shift was coming, but I hadn't quite sort of connected with that. So then I went to university because I wanted to get out of the kitchen. I had this strong sense that being a chef was great when you were young, but not something you should do as a grown-up.
Had you had writing gigs at this point, or were you, is it sort of a decision, I'm going to make a little bit of a change here?
No, I hadn't written. I mean, I'd been writing since I was primary school, but I had nothing published. School newspaper, actually. I think I was deputy editor of the school newspaper.
I totally appreciate it. I've got a horrendously long and bad dead novel in a drawer, a digital drawer somewhere. So I hear you, Tim.
Yeah. Everyone should have. Everyone who has a published book should have at least one, and ideally more than that will never be published. So I went to university to study journalism at Cheltenham University of Gloucestershire, and then I went to Indonesia, which I'd spent time in traveling before, but I went to teach English, took a year's teaching contract, but I had a very specific idea that I was going to work at being a professional writer while I was there. I was going to try and start publishing stuff. And journalism, magazine journalism, mostly travel pieces, narrative travel articles, cultural journalism, lifestyle journalism for in-flight magazines, English language newspaper in Jakarta. And then having finished teaching after a year, I then worked part-time for a very small, very rickety newspaper in Bali. And then I started getting guidebook work for Insight guides, DK Eyewitness guides, a little bit for the AA, a little bit for Rough Guides. And then I came back to trying to write a full-length book, which is my first book, which is a kind of narrative history book, but it's a kind of a crypto travel book, because it was I followed in the footsteps of a 19th century explorer called George Hayward. I didn't really write the first person narrative of that, apart from in a kind of epilogue, but it's very much as a sense of landscape and movement, because I kind of moved through all the places. And then I kind of wrote guidebooks mostly then for the day job, for the bread and butter money, but wrote sort of narrative history books with a bit of travel on the side. And then I got funding in my sort of late 30s to do a PhD at the University of Leicester, looking at travel writing, which was something I'd always kind of had in the back of my mind. I kind of wanted to do that. And that kind of coincided with the decline of the guidebook industry as a viable career, really. It was sort of dying at that point. And then I sort of flipped into academia as the day job, which is great, because it means I don't have to write things I don't want to write anymore.
We were discussing before, now you're teaching literature in Ireland. Have so many recommendations. I don't know if we'll get to them all, but what I was wondering is, was the Cornish book something that was always in the back of your mind, or was it something that was miles away? I'm never writing about this place. What was the genesis of I'm going to write a Cornish book? Because, as I said in the YouTube video I did the other day, it really felt, reading it, like you poured a lot into this.
Yeah.
And picking a book for a book club is quite difficult for me. And I kind of thought, Sherlock Pages has to be different. And I want to pick something with a little bit of meat to it, and I like that people really can get stuck into. So this is why I kind of gravitated towards your book. So I'm just wondering, where did you feel like I've got to address this topic now? I've got to explore my homeland.
Yeah. So okay. There's a complicated answer to that. So the first things I ever wrote as a child were all short stories set around where I'm from. Very, very specific, small place in the far west of Cornwall. So I've been writing about it forever. But then I did all this travel writing about far off places, Southeast Asia mainly. And people did used to say to me, and I say this in the book, people used to say to me, when are you going to write a book about Cornwall? And I'd always say, I'm kind of practicing on India and Indonesia. I will do it one day. I did actually in maybe 15 years ago now, think I might do a book about Cornwall that will be kind of narrative history, but with each chapter would be a little travelogue. So I would kind of go to Bodmin Moor and do a bit of a walk, and then use that as a framework for talking about prehistory, and do it that way. And I did a couple of sample chapters, and I sent it to my agent, and he said, I just don't think this is working. And I think I must have known that myself, because I sort of said, fine, and put it aside. And then sort of 10 years later, he came back to me and said, would you do something about Cornwall? Every time I turn on the television, I see Cornwall. I think Cornwall is kind of hot right now. So this was sort of, I think, kind of COVID era. And I didn't remind him about this one from 10 years earlier. But I had been kind of mulling over it, because I had sort of just done a book called The Travel Writing Tribe, which kind of emerged from my PhD research, which was basically a travel book about travel writing, a very kind of meta thing where I kind of flipped travel writing in on itself, and I turned the famous travel writers into the natives, and went and treated them like an exotic tribe. And that book was basically a kind of interrogation of travel writing, my kind of unease, my ethical unease. Is travel writing problematic? Well, it is problematic, but is it redeemable? So I did that book, and kind of came to the conclusion that it is redeemable. Of course it is. It's nice to do it in a particular way. But I was then faced with the question of what do you do next? So having done this kind of meta quest of a travel book about travel writing, the logical place to go was a travel book that's about the place you're actually from. So it kind of does that meta loop again. It would have been a bit weird for me to have done the travel writing tribe and then just gone to India. That kind of wouldn't have worked. So I was, when my agent came to me with that, I was actually already mulling it over, because I was thinking, how do I follow up the travel writing tribe? What do I do next?
It feels like a nice set of circumstances where the publishing industry is kind of ready for it, and you were also ready for it as well. And so we've already gone for 10 minutes, so I might just therefore kind of dive into some of the questions that people.
Great, please do.
So I'm going to read out their handles on Instagram. So this is @speed.melissa. She said, of all the things you discovered or learned on your journey, which was your favorite? So quite a kind of broad question there, because I guess what immediately comes to mind.
It's I don't know if favorite is the right word, and in some senses this would be a slight spoiler, but we're a book club, so you kind of assume that people have read the book. We're not trying to sell the book. So spoiler alert, kind of spoiler alert. It was The Butler. No, it's not that kind of book. The thing that I did discover, and I always feel like people aren't going to believe me when I say this, but it is genuinely true. Doing the journey, the physical journey, really brought home to me, allowed me to actually actively, consciously realize for the first time that Cornwall is a very big place. It's not. It's 80 miles from one end to the other, but it is a huge place. And when I'd been for my entire life associating myself with Cornwall, I hadn't actually thought through what that meant. So if you said to me, where are you from? I'd say Cornwall. And then if you said to me, what does Cornwall mean to you? I would give a certain set of characteristics. And what I hadn't understood is that I had conflated Cornwall with home. And they were two distinct things. Somewhere that's 80 miles long and contains, almost 500,000 residents, and various microclimates and radically different landscapes. That's not home. Home is a much smaller and narrower thing, unless you're adopting a political position about what home is, and I've got problems with that. So that was my genuinely revelatory discovery, was that I had been conflating home, which for me is really firmly bordered as Penwith, the furthest western bit, which you came to for the video the other day.
Me and Agat love Penwith, and we've been on several holidays there now, out of season, and it's a wild, eerie landscape, I find, and atmospheric, and it just is very distinctive. So it even feels distinctive from 10 miles away.
It does, yeah. And within it, because it is very so we're here on the north coast of Penwith, on the for people who know Cornwall, we're about halfway between St Ives and Land's End, on that very rugged, very kind of big granite hills running up there, and the sea is quarter of a mile that way. But you drive 5 miles to Penzance, and it's subtropical gardens and palm trees, and on that coast, these little wooded valleys running down to very sheltered coves. So you get this intense difference within a really tiny area. It's sort of like you've taken Cornwall and condensed it into this one peninsula, which is about 12 miles long and 5 or 6 miles across, and it's the final bit. So it is almost an island, and that I have a clear affiliation with the whole of that, and that's home. But I conflated that with Cornwall. And if you happen to come from mid Cornwall, the clay country, you come from Bodmin Moor, you come from the sort of south coast around Looe, those are just radically different places. And if you took someone from there and said, where are you from? And they said Cornwall. What does Cornwall mean to you? What they would say would be completely different. So that's my, I guess, favorite thing, because it allowed me to slightly step back from big Cornwall and realize that, okay, yeah, no, I'm from Penwith, and actually very specifically from the north coast of Penwith. So that was my favorite or most important thing that I discovered.
That's a really great answer. And it moves on to a question that is from Hilary Hurtle, which is, so how did walking through the landscape shape what you were going to write about? Did you find the overall story taking shape as you walked, as though the landscape was giving you suggestions, or was it a mix of your original intent and what the landscape brought forth to you? Which I thought was such a good question.
Oh, that's a great question. The short answer is yes, that last thing. But the slightly longer answer is, well, actually, this is something interesting that I mean, some people will know, but it may be an interesting insight to have publishing industry stuff for some people. For people who aren't aware, non-fiction functions in a particular way in the publishing industry. So if you write a novel, generally speaking, you write the novel, and then the novel is sort of submitted as a finished work. Now, if you've had one very successful novel, you might get lucky and they might sign you up for a 3-book deal or something like that. But generally speaking, a novel is sold as a complete work. Non-fiction is generally sold on the proposal, not the complete book. So an agent, or if you're doing it yourself to smaller presses, you write up a proposal for what this book's going to be about, and that is what the publisher commissions. So they commission it as an unfinished work. Now, first-time non-fiction authors will typically have written the whole thing and will submit it on spec. But even if you've done that, your agent will then ask you to sort of retrospectively put it together as a proposal. Now, this is really weird with travel and nature writing, where there's going to be a physical journey, because you have to sort of imagine that you've done the journey and write up a proposal where you say, and then I walked from, when you haven't actually done it, because you're not setting out to undertake it until it's been confirmed this is going ahead. So when I was putting together the proposal for the Granite Kingdom, I looked at the map and had a vague sense of the different topics I wanted to discuss. So I sort of plotted this looping route, thinking, okay, I'm going to talk about attitudes to the landscape and Bodmin Moor. That'll work. So I'll kind of go that way. Definitely want to talk about smugglers and pirates and wreckers and all the mythology around that. That will work on the south coast. Definitely need to talk about mining. So I'm going to do that in Camborne and Redruth. That didn't happen. That's not where I talked about that. I talked about that somewhere else. So the original proposal and chapter plan was not exactly the route and was not exactly the order, but it kind of gave a shape to it. And it's actually a really useful exercise if you're thinking about writing a book like this, going through the process of writing a proposal. I always make my students who are doing a kind of non-fiction project for their dissertations, I always make them write a full book proposal, because I think it's really important.
Tim, because I'm going through this exactly at this moment. So I wrote a proposal that had 8 chapters. I then wanted to do 10, and I'm sort of, I was nervous about even having the conversation, because you're right, they do commission a work, and that's what they want. So it's like, don't mess with it too much. Although, of course, there's creative freedom within that to a degree.
Yeah. I mean, in my experience, generally, if what you deliver is broadly that book, they're not going to say, oh, well, you said you were going to go to St. Austell before you went to Newquay. You're going to have to change those chapters. That doesn't happen, so long as it's essentially the same book. But it's a useful process, because then you kind of have a shape. But once I started the journey, I knew roughly I was going to do this, but not exactly which path I would take. I was making that up as I went along. I'd look at the map every morning and think, okay, I'll probably go that valley actually, and then sometimes halfway through the day you just think, oh, I need to take a shorter route, I'm going to go that way. And then what happens is those individual encounters or individual things that you see them, and that sparks something. And then when you come to actually write it up, like the notes of that, and you want to talk about whatever it might be, the surrealist artist Eiffel Cahoon, and I think, where's she going to come up? And there's this lovely process of problem solving. And then you end up with bits left at the end. I kind of work with a big map and lots of post-it notes on the wall, which I'm in the middle of at the moment. And there are several lonely post-it notes that are not in the right place. This is the current book. and I'm thinking, where am I going to talk about the sort of the biology of Irish hares? I meant to do that earlier, and they're floating around. I've worked it out, by the way. This morning I found just the spot. This isn't the current book. So it's a mix. That's the long version of what the question had already said.
Vicky Guy 43 asks, well, she said to me, please can you ask Tim about his writing process? Obviously there is a lot of research that goes into it. A staggering amount of research, really. Does he do the research before visiting, or does the research come later? And again, it might be a hybrid. I don't know, but you know, why do you find the approach that you take? Like, what are the benefits of it? Whatever.
Yeah. So the answer to the specific question is, yeah, it is a hybrid. I would obviously Cornwall. I've been reading about Cornwall and know quite a lot about Cornwall for my whole life. So I had a pretty solid set of kind of background stuff there, and that gave me the shape. But then you'd kind of go down these rabbit holes, or something would kind of come out, or you think this is a way to get this in, and that happens afterwards. So you kind of have done the broad research to think, okay, I'm going to talk about the history of smuggling and wrecking or whatever at this point, and I do know roughly the parameters of that, and I'm thinking about that while I'm walking, because I think this is definitely where I'm going to talk about that. So I'm looking out for things, and I go, oh, Smuggler's Cottage in the notebook, that'll be a hook for that when I get to that bit in the chapter. But then when I'm writing, I am able to kind of write and research at the same time, and I'm forever kind of chasing up leads, and you'll sort of see something and you'll think, 16th century, I wonder what kind of bread they ate in the 16th century, and then you waste half a day on obscure academic articles on that, which ends up being half a line in a book, something like that.
That makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, as a writer myself, and kind of entering into a much longer book now that I'm writing, I sort of have loose ideas of places that I'll be definitely interested in, but then I do a lot of research retrospectively. Actually. So I guess whatever kind of fits for you.
So my current book, which is about Ireland, which I mean I live there, and I know the broad history pretty well, and that was again in place before the journey, and I knew what's going to be roughly in each chapter. But with that, the kind of rabbit hole side of things is a lot more intense. It's actually been a lot slower, because I'll just find that I've spent 2 days reading about something that ends up as half a footnote. So it was a little bit more controlled in the Cornwall case, because I knew more of that stuff, even though if it was kind of in this big disorganized cloud, I knew more of that stuff already, the minutiae, than I do on the current one.
Sure. And I just want to give people who have joined us live, we're hovering about 100 people, which is 5 times more than I was expecting. So that's wonderful.
Hi, everyone.
Just to give us some questions, comments, I will try and manage it as best I can. But I've just been told to make sure that you are writing questions as you go. We have a lot of questions, as I said, that have already come in. Someone asked, and I think this goes back to your physical journey, and I just want to ask, how difficult did you find the physical journey? Because I actually was quite astonished by the distances you covered, and it's not the easiest of terrains, particularly in the summer. And then someone wrote, I'm curious about camping in Cornwall. Can you just camp on public land without a permit? So if you could just talk about like some of the physicality of that journey, how you found it, walking those distances, and then the camping aspects, because I'm guessing people might want to do some parts of this, and actually I'll remind you if you forget, but like, what are some of the best parts that people might want to walk? Sorry, I've asked
those are great questions. I noted from your brilliant video you did the other day that you had suffered in the heat on the Saints Way, Luke.
It was the start of the heat wave, and it is so remote, and I could feel it coming, and I was just thinking, right, as soon as I get somewhere, I'm going to stop. But the first place I got was almost at the end, and
there's not much through there. So it was the summer of the one when we were coming out of the pandemic, 2021, I think, 21. It's 2021, which was very hot. But also peculiarly unstable. The summer felt a little bit ill-tempered. There would be this intense heat, and then you just get this kind of spasm of nasty weather. So that was the kind of condition while I was doing the walk. So there were some really hot days. I remember in particular coming down from Newquay down to Perranporth and then inland towards Truro, and that day was just one of those days where you're just slogging along and the sweat pouring off you. So it was physically tough in places because you're carrying a backpack with a tent and with cooking gear and all of that. And no matter how many times I do this, I always end up with too much weight in the backpack. And you always end up having these kind of visions of, oh, I'm going to sort of sit under an oak tree and read a book in the afternoon. And I never do. I end up walking on. And every time I think I am not going to walk on until dusk. And then I end up doing it over again. And having just walked across Ireland for the current project, it was exactly the same. I am not going to walk 40 kilometers ever again. And then how many kilometers did I do today? Oh, 39.5.
That would be my number one piece of advice to someone is walk a third less than you want to, and you'll be happy.
Exactly. So it was physically tough, but I think that's kind of part of it. I was reflecting on that a lot in the walk I've just done across Ireland for the next book, that actually so much of a long distance walk is low level pain, and I think that's actually part of the attraction, because there's that glorious relief at the end. You get into a campsite and you shower and you put flip-flops on. I think that was a few extra grams in the bag, but it was worth putting them in the bag, the flip-flops. And just that release and that relief. So I think that kind of low-level pain that does characterize an awful lot of long-distance walking is part of the attraction. So yeah, it was definitely tough in places. But I always had the kind of sense of I was going home, so there was a momentum with me. I was moving, even though it was a ridiculously meandering route. I did have this momentum, and there was this sense of kind of picking up as I moved towards the end. Kind of the energy rose. The energy rose right to the end, and then the final day, which is really just the epilogue. I don't really address it. Well, I kind of cover it in the very short epilogue at the end of the book. That was an incredibly hot day, and I was just absolutely drained. It wasn't kind of intellectually drained because I'd been thinking about this stuff all the way, and that time I didn't sit and read books under oak trees or in the middle of ancient monuments. I just kind of flopped and lay there for an hour, and then managed to do another 1.5 miles and flopped again. So it was tough, but that's part of the fun. The camping question. Yeah, Luke, did you want to jump in, and then I'll do the camping thing?
No, I find that because someone asked me when I was doing the Saints Way, and I was saying I was going to do it online, and I've done quite a lot of pilgrimages now. Someone asked me, why do you do this? And I was thinking, there's all sorts of reasons why, but even when I'm walking, I'll be like, why am I doing this sometimes? And I was just wondering, did that ever happen where you're like, oh gosh, this is a lot, this is almost too much? Or
it didn't in Cornwall, but the one I've just finished for the island, well, it was last year I did the walk. Yeah, there was a couple of sort of crisis points. Ireland is a lot tougher to walk across because they don't have public footpaths, which is kind of part of the theme of the book. So there was a lot of road walking. There are a few long distance trails, and that's kind of the theme of that book. It's the fact that Ireland does not have, this ties into the camping question actually, does not have public access to the countryside the way that England and Wales specifically have. Scotland has full right to roam, but England and Wales have a very specific, complex, but actually very effective mechanism of countryside access, which relates to the question. Ireland, there is no right of access to the countryside at all. There is permissive access to some state land, state forestry, some mountain areas, and there are a number of permissive long distance trails, but there is no such thing as a public right of way in Ireland, and there's no such thing as access land right to roam. So Ireland was tough, and there were a few places, particularly as I was getting towards the end, where it was just more and more and more roads, and I was kind of actually looking into 3 or 4 days of total road walking, and the weather was horrible, and I did think, will I just not do this? And I genuinely thought that. I mean, it was a contracted book, so I don't know what I would have done if I didn't, but I did kind of get to a point of thinking, this is ridiculous. I've been defeated. And then I picked myself up and carried on, and actually had brilliant experiences in the final stages of that walk. So didn't happen in Cornwall though. because Cornwall's good. It's gone a bit glitchy. Am I still with you? Luke, you froze up for me there. Am I freezing too?
And what about, can you tell us a little bit about the practicalities of camping?
I can. Luke's disappeared. I'm in charge. I'm the captain now.
Hold on.
I'll answer the camping question, hoping and presuming that everyone can see me. I'm guessing the person who asked that question, because of the use of the phrase public land, is possibly from North America, not from Europe, certainly not from the UK. Might be wrong about that, but that's my guess. There really isn't effectively any public land in the UK. It kind of doesn't exist. There's a certain amount, but not really. What we have here is a disaggregation of ownership and access as rights. So mountain and moorland, lots of moorland in Cornwall, is designated as access land regardless of who owns it. So most of it is private ownership. But if it's open country, it's called access land. It's tinted sort of tobacco coloured on the maps, on the 1 to 25,000, 1 to 50,000 maps. And that's land that you can walk freely on. You can walk anywhere you want on that. Off of that into the sort of farmland, you'll see these networks of little green lines, and those are the footpaths. Those are public rights of way, so you walk on them. There isn't an actual right to wild camp anywhere apart from Dartmoor. In England and Wales, there are a few places where you can do it if you register first, but Dartmoor is the only place where you can technically, with allowance, wild camp. In practice, people have always, for years and years, camped discreetly in those areas that are access land. So Bodmin Moor, the Penrith Moors, the wild bits, and in discreet sort of beaches and so on. Luke,
sorry,
yes.
Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you.
You can hear me. You just can't see me. I'm so sorry about this, Tim. Hopefully we'll get my camera back in just a...
That's all right. I can hear you, and I'm hoping and guessing everyone can see me. So I answered the camping question. So yeah, technically you're there. You're not actually allowed to, but so long as you're discreet, so long as you very strictly follow the kind of leave no trace principles, and I would generally caution anyone against sort of camping wild in a road-based way. I think that's where the problems usually arise, where people do it off a road, and unfortunately that quite often catches cyclists up. People are doing long distance cycling again. People do, but you need to work a little bit more. Whereas if you're walking and you're 5 miles from a road in the middle of Bodmin Moor, you're not going to have a problem.
Tim, you can hear me okay. So that's half the battle. We had a question here from the perfectly named Wandering Through History. That question is, how did your understanding of Cornwall change through your writing of the book, historically, culturally, or emotionally? I think we've already been... I'm back. The IT freshman.
You're back.
Hold on. Are we back? Okay, are you going to say hello? I called in the crisis engineer. So
the sound is fine, so I can hear you. I got the question.
I was saying, I think you've answered it emotionally, how your perception of Cornwall and being Cornish changed, but on that point about historically and culturally, how did your understanding of Cornwall change?
Yeah, I that's a really important question. In a way, that's the kind of impetus of the book. So there was, as well as that need to think, what do I do next, having done this weird meta travel book about travel writing, there was this little kind of itch, this slight unease about some of the discourse coming out of Cornwall about Cornish history. So I'd always been someone very proud to be Cornish, very sort of like, I'm Cornish, and very quick to say, oh, Cornwall is not England, because that's kind of comforting, and it's nice to say that. It's a sort of reassuring thing. It gives you this sense of identity, and it generally was a sort of proto-nationalism. It didn't have a nasty edge, but I had just begun to just be slightly uneasy about the way some episodes from Cornish history were being narrated on Facebook posts. And maybe it's being an academic and having a very high standard of sort of criticality, sort of wanting to ask every time, are you sure? Fact check that. Are you sure? How has that been spun? And there were just certain things about, particularly the relationship between Cornwall and England, particularly these certain kind of key historical rebellions that were being narrated in a particular way that I just thought, that's probably not true, is it? Or what you're saying is a very spun version of that story, and probably a real historian and professional historian, which I'm not. I'm a literature scholar by academic background, but I like history. Probably an actual historian would unpick that. And it's something as simple as saying, well, there was this Cornish rebellion in the mid-16th century. So that must be a kind of, an oppressed people rebelling against the tyrannical English oppressors. So we'll call it the Anglo-Cornish War. And it can be something as simple as just zooming back out and saying, what else was going on in England at the time? Oh, and there were rebellions all over England on very similar issues in the same period. So suddenly you've got a context, and as soon as you put that context in place, that idea of it being the Anglo-Cornish War doesn't quite work. So it and that's uncomfortable if you've had this quite simple narrative of the Celtic nation of Cornwall, which has, gone through 1,000 years of oppression and now gets to raise its flag and whatever. And so it was a slightly uncomfortable process of pushing myself into those blurry, not quite black and white zones. And that's the kind of message I'm trying to get across in the book, is actually that's a great place. If you can make yourself comfortable or confident enough in your identity of place to go into that place and say, well, and people are doing that in Ireland as well. The whole idea that actually Ireland, despite being a colony, was very complicit in wider empire. I mean, there are lots of Irish slave owners, and those were Catholic Irish slave owners, some of them. There were huge numbers of Irish soldiers fighting for Britain in South Asia and so on. So people are starting to do that in Ireland as well, in a funny way, moving into that slightly uncomfortable zone. I think is a positive thing, because it, nationalism can lead you to pretty dark places, even when it's what seems like a really benign little micro nationalism, as they would be called.
It's definitely there in certain parts. But what has been the response from kind of Cornish friends and family? Probably those responses are as varied as readers and as people are, but just people must have it particularly in their hearts. And
I've been really surprised. I was kind of scared. I've never been nervous about the book being published before, but I was kind of thinking, I was kind of ready for it, because I was thinking some of these things need to be said. Some of these that we need to stop saying that the language was deliberately oppressed as a policy of state, that they beat the Cornish out, which is just not true. It's just not true. We need to stop saying that 1549 was the Anglo-Cornish War. It wasn't, and that it was all about language. It just wasn't. We need to stop saying that these are, black and white two peoples. That's the English and the Cornish. It's just not true. It's way more hazy and way more interesting where things get kind of blurry. So I was ready to stand that up, but I was expecting a lot more kind of pushback from the angry people online with sort of Cornish flags in their biopics. And I really kind of haven't. And I've had loads of people who know a lot about Cornish history and are big into it being really positive. So I saw a guy, an older guy, who's dad of one of my school friends. Literally, I saw him on Tuesday night at More of a Pasti Day. More of a Pasti Day. Well, that's our annual festival. First Tuesday in August. And he said, and he is really big into Cornish history, knows an awful lot about it. And he said, oh, your book changed the way I thought about Cornwall. And I was bloody hell, because he was exactly the kind of person I would have thought might be, oh, come on, boy, what was all this nonsense now? So I was really careful. As I was working on it, I was trying to anticipate all those possible lines, and in a way setting little, almost like traps for people to, if you want, so sort of like about my own ancestry, not I was born here, I was brought up here, my mum's been here her whole life. Her her mum and her grandma were here for most of their lives, but none of them were actually born here. So putting that in place where I did in the book, that was another spoiler there. Those were all kind of deliberate little elephant traps for people who wanted to maybe push back in a certain way. But it seems to have worked, because I've only had positive responses from within Cornwall, which is great.
That is great to hear. And I love the fact that you've been to Morva Pasti Night, because we had a customer at Sherlock Pages who actually did a pasty count during the... I can't remember what Kerry, if you remember how many pasties Rick counted, let us know in the comments. It was Can you explain what a Cornish pasty is to anyone who doesn't know?
Yeah, that's the only bit where I get kind of flag wavingly aggressively nationalistic is about the pasty. So the pasty is Cornwall's national dish. It is, people will say when you're trying to explain, people who are maybe not from the UK say, oh, that's a pie, right? If you're from
it's got the thick edge because of mining, right? Or is that have I just delved into?
Wow, so there are actually photos of miners from the late 19th century just eating their pasties, like pasty, top to tail. It's a nice story. It's not particularly well evidenced. It started to get kind of bandied around, and then you'll get people claiming that they were miners in the 60s and 70s, and that's the way they ate their pasties. I'm suspicious that they may have been told that by a book and then gone and done it, because that's the thing about sort of folkloric practice. But there are photos of miners from sort of 1900s, late 19th century, eating their pasties the way we eat them today, wrapped in a cloth, usually not in a paper bag with warrants on it, but in a cloth, and eating them like that. So I don't think that's true. It's a pie, folks who don't know, if you're Australian. But it's a turnover. It's a folded. So it's a ring of pastry folded over into half moon shape and crimped along the edge, never on the top. Has to be crimped on the edge to be a Cornish pasty. And the filling is potato, onion, swede, which we always call turnip in Cornwall, but swede, which is kind of like a rutabaga for anyone from the US. And then beef, and it should be skirt beef, which is from the abdomen, which is quite fatty, which that kind of makes it juicy. Loads of salt and pepper, loads of black pepper, and you shouldn't really put anything else in it. That's how pasties were designated as a protected cultural item in the EU before we left.
We've seen in the book, you can get them all over Cornwall. So if you ever visit,
yeah, I mean, look, one thing I should add to all of that: people get very serious about what goes in them, and I have a thing in the book about me discovering a really wrong Australian pasty many years ago. Actually, historically, that fixed set of ingredients wouldn't have been true. I mean, your average miner or farmer or fisherman in the 19th century wasn't having beef in it every day. They would have put whatever they had, which might even have included carrots. I think that strict set of ingredients was a late 20th century thing, really, but people take it seriously.
Yeah, there's all these historic traps that lay in wait for us as writers and as thinkers. Somebody wrote in the chat that, and I can understand this, that did they read the book with did anyone else read the book with a map with them? I can imagine that my mental map of Cornwall is quite good, having visited many times. But so when you were referring to certain places, I automatically bring it to mind. But what this comment made me think of is, what kind of cultural consumables, whether they be books or films or even music or something, would you recommend that someone gets into to kind of understand Cornwall and its landscapes? This is why I particularly wanted to do that YouTube video just before the other day, because I was thinking I need to show people how special Zena in particular is. I just love that coastline there, which is kind of your coastline, right? I was like, I've got to go and show people, because otherwise they just won't understand. And I can't express or impress upon people who haven't visited how special Cornwall is. It's world class, its landscape. So yeah, what could they watch or listen to or read that might help? What are some highlights you think, Tim? Of course.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. Just picking up on that map comment. Yeah, I mean, it's funny, when I read a travel book, I kind of don't need the map, and I will often have read a book about, whatever, Patrick Leigh Moore's Time of Gifts and Between the Woods and the Water and Broken Road, that sort of great trilogy. I've no idea where he is. I mean, he could be in, I don't know, that sort of Central, Eastern or Middle Europe down into the Balkans. And I read those books and there is a map and I look and I go, I have no idea wherever it is he is. So I kind of don't need a map, but I know other people do. There is a map in the book, but it could probably do with being one of the, in those Victorian travel books where there'd be a kind of fold out map in the back that was the size of a table. So maybe I should lobby for something like that in the next book. I do appreciate some people really need the map. So things, cultural product. Yeah, one of the lovely things actually that I'm really, really excited by is that Cornwall in the last few years seems to have been producing kind of particularly in literature, good stuff from within. And for a long time, it kind of didn't. It's not that there weren't people writing here. There were loads of people writing here and there always have been, but there wasn't quite this sense of a contemporary Cornish literature in the way that you could definitely say about Wales. And I think Wales and Cornwall, there's a particular relationship there in terms of maybe a model Cornwall might look to Wales. And Wales very confidently in both Welsh language and in English, you could say there is a Welsh literature, a contemporary Welsh literature, people writing about Welsh stuff in fiction and so on. And that kind of, there hadn't been a sense of a body of stuff, but I sort of think there is now coming out of Cornwall. So a writer I always mention is Natasha Carthew, and I imagine that you've had Undercurrent in the bookshop, which is a really good memoir. Now that was kind of probably the book that has somewhat broken Natasha through, but she's been around for a long time writing fiction, sort of billed as young adult fiction, but actually works well as literary fiction for adults. And she did do one novel that was pitched at adults. Really distinctively Cornish voice, kind of gritty stuff. She's from East Cornwall and her stuff tends to all be around that area, which is a completely alien place to me. So she was there a little bit ahead of the curve, but there's been some really good sort of slightly folk horror-y stuff in the last couple of years. Jodie Matthews has a book called Meet Me at the Surface, which is great, set around Bodmin Moor, and it has this kind of folklore underpinning, but in this kind of playful, self-aware way. And that's a really, really great book. Charlie Carroll's novel The Lip as well, which is in that same sort of territory. It's got this slightly gritty representation of current Cornwall. And there's been a few sort of collections of short fiction out and about. There definitely feels like there's something kind of bubbling up, and you would now be able to say, there is a visible contemporary literature of Cornwall. So that's dig into some of that stuff.
I'll have to look at some of those. So I do hope that this live stream does go straight on to YouTube after. And Undercurrent, it was particularly interesting to us because I think it's worth us exploring just very briefly that. So Cornwall, I remember taking a GAT there for the first time, and I was very mindful and said, you're going to see these parts of Cornwall like Padstow and Rock and maybe St. Maur's on the south coast that are very, very wealthy, certainly in parts, and they project a kind of a wealthy veneer. And it might just be a veneer, but there's certainly people with a lot of money, and the property prices have gone through the roof. But that is certainly not the full picture. And I mean, I don't know if it still is, but Cornwall is amongst the lowest average income counties in the whole of England for sure.
Oh no, it absolutely is. This is where the sort of people who don't like to call Cornwall England and don't like to call Cornwall a county, and there's quite a lot of those people. There's people who will leap up. There are now people frantically typing it's a duchy because you said the C word there, Luke. There is always this little kind of a bit of a trap that they fall into, because you have to give that statistic, which is that as a county and as part of England, Cornwall is the poorest, and has historically been for a very long time. I think it's sort of surpassed by some of the Welsh Valley areas, but particularly as a sort of rural area, poverty indicators as a non-urban area, Cornwall is sort of off the scale, which tends to surprise people. But then, you know, look a little closer and you can see that. And I think that's the thing that Natasha Carthy in Undercurrent addresses well. And she's always kind of talked about this stuff, that the rural, she makes a very strong sort of thing about being rural working class. I have a slightly different perspective on that, but that's partly because I'm from West Cornwall, where things are a bit different. It's a very weirdly classless place. But that idea of rural poverty not necessarily being in your face, you can travel through, you can maybe even own a second home there and not notice it in the same way. So yeah, I mean, that's absolutely the case.
We talked about that, didn't we, the other day, that once you get off the coast in Cornwall, it changes dramatically. And when you're walking these routes, you're going to be seeing things that are totally different from what average tourists' experience of Cornwall might be, because they may just stay right on the edge, and that's all that people are going to see. And there is a whole world in the interior, which
there is, but I think it's always important to say that you know, people do live in Padstow and St Ives and Newquay, and an awful lot of them are having a very hard time, and they're people who have been there their whole lives, and they're certainly not living in those big glass and concrete things down the front. So I think there can be, and something I always try to push back on as well, there's this idea that, oh, you know, there's the tourist Cornwall and there's the real Cornwall. And I always think, well, how does that make you feel if you're from St Ives and you're kind of struggling financially, and that's where you're from, and somebody online says to people, oh, there's no good in going to St Ives, that's not the real Cornwall. Well, it is the real Cornwall, as much as you know, whatever kind of gritty thing these people are suggesting you go to. So yeah, I mean, it's all kind of intermeshed, but you're dead right about, you know, leaving the coast. See, a lot of people will say, you know, Cornwall's saturated with tourism, it's over touristed, but it's August now, and I could head off for a walk now in the last of the light and walk for 10 miles and not see another soul. I could do that in the middle of the daytime. It's very, the kind of intense tourism is if you kind of mapped it, you'd see that length of Cornwall, you'd see these little red dots where there are certainly thousands and thousands of people, but then it's very thinly spread over the rest of it, especially inland.
Yeah, my uncle actually read it, who's in Canada now, and he said it reminded him of the situation in Hawaii, surprisingly.
Oh, yeah, no, I can totally see that. Yeah.
And he said they've recently been, either they've brought in or been discussing a law where it's illegal to rent somewhere for less than 90 days, but they're accepting designated tourist zones. So that kind of goes back to your point again, like what is a tourist zone then? And have there been moves towards, I think there were some other complexities to these rules in Hawaii, but have there been moves? I mean, I definitely have seen that there has been like attempts to insert social housing in new developments, and that these have to, you know, you have to show local links and such things, but it just seems like it's a problem, not only in Cornwall, but in many places, but it's particularly
it's in many places. Yeah, that's interesting. I'm really pleased that he felt that Hawaii parallel. I've been to Hawaii a long time ago when I was a teenage surfer. Went to Hawaii, and there was a vibe. And Hawaii, you know, we were on public transport going back and forwards from the North Shore to Honolulu, and you go through some towns that kind of would be the Hawaii equivalent of Camborne and Redruth and St Austell in Cornwall. And I at the time I thought, this is the same thing. There are people living normal lives here and quite often having a bit of a hard time, and then there's all this stuff going wrong, and the tourism isn't the problem, because the tourism is what brings a lot of the money, and it's how it impacts, and particularly when it gets to housing. So I'm delighted that he saw that Hawaii parallel. That's great. Bali would be the other place that I know well, and there's Bali has clear parallels too, with that.
I think this kind of made me want to ask a question which has been on the edge of my mind this whole conversation, and just looking at that move from kind of travel writing as you described it, maybe in the 1980s, where it's quite adventurous, almost quite maybe light-hearted at times, and then this move to nature writing. You've done this very kind of inward-looking journey just into it. Where do you think we stand, and what would be your advice to young people who maybe 30 years ago would have been heading out trying to be travel writers, kind of, robust, charismatic, dashing. All right, that era kind of feels like it's gone a little bit, and we're in this really rich era of nature writing, but some of it, I fear some of the nature writing can be a little bit superficial. It can be a little bit could even be seen as twee. And I say that as a shop that we sell a lot of nature writing, but we really great. But I'm just wondering where you see that we are in that whole kind of debate. And
that's great. Oh, thanks, Luke. That's kind of, those are my questions. So I very much see a continuity and a parallel between that travel writing that you were talking about and then what has often been called nature writing over the last 20 years. And I think there's a commonality. Now I have argued in an academic sense a bunch of conference papers on the idea that in that first wave of what was sometimes called the new nature writing, with Robert Macfarlane very much as the kind of the totemic figure of that was travel writing. I mean, nature and landscape was often a key theme, but it was travel writing, and it was travel writing in a pretty unbroken tradition from the travel writing that went before, from the likes of Paul Theroux, Bruce Chatwin, Colin Thubron, Jonathan Raban, all big blokes. And then there were in the kind of 90s, the second generation that came in the 90s, there were some women around, mainly Sarah Wheeler, but it was a very kind of blokish thing, this kind of intellectual journey, but very, this slightly machismo intellect. And it was a journey thing, and I know Robert Macfarlane cops quite a lot of flack from people, but I mean none of us would be here without. I don't think your bookshop would be there without
no.
And I wouldn't have written the books I've written without him, so I won't say bad things about him, and a beautiful writer as well. And I think Wild Places, which was really the book that kind of put a rocket under the nature writing movement, is a brilliant travel book as a piece of craft, as a piece of narrative construction, whatever other things you might say about it. But as that, it's just masterful. And I think he did a very rare thing, because one of the slight technical problems with this nature writing, travel writing that has come to dominate, is it tends not to be somebody heading off for 6 months across Afghanistan. It tends to be a journalist or an academic with a day job putting together one of these narratives over weekends. And it can create this slight disjointed thing. You don't always get this satisfying sense of a genuinely immersive single journey. And actually the Wild Places, Robert Macfarlane, that is weekends amongst the academic day job over 18 months. But he manages brilliantly, and nobody else has ever done it, I don't think, as well, to take those bitty individual experiences and create that arc. And I don't think I could do it, which is why it's really important for me to have that core journey, the walk through Cornwall, the walk across Ireland, as a single core journey. That's just a point to make about that. So I think there was that continuity from that travel writing into nature writing, but I think you can also take them as equivalent. So the travel writing boom of the late 20th century really kicked off with a couple of books in the mid 70s, with Paul Theroux's Great Railway Bazaar and Bruce Chatwin's In Patagonia, which suddenly made travel writing, which had been around forever, of course, but suddenly made it this cool literary thing. And Granta, which had just re-established itself and become this cool literary magazine in the early 80s, really got behind travel writing and pushed travel writing as the cool literary genre. And it was huge. They were household names, Thubron, Theroux, Chatwin, through the 80s. And then you got this second wave of Sarah Wheeler, Philip Marsden, William Dalrymple, and so on, and also dozens of people whose names are forgotten now. And I think a very similar pattern happened with the nature writing. So that travel writing boom lasted about 25 years and fizzled out around about the year 2000 as a publishing phenomenon. And at about that point, 1999, Roger Deakin published Waterlog, which is often seen as the text of what became the new nature writing. Then about 7 or 8 years later, 5 years later, Macfarlane published his first book. Then 2008, Granta published the new nature writing edition. Wild Places came out, and you suddenly had this great surge. So we're actually about 25 years in now, which by the model of travel writing in the previous 25 years does mean we should be reaching a kind of end point, because travel writing sort of fizzled out. And nobody's mentioned it, but the Salt Path scenario might actually be a bit of a crisis point. And I think maybe we are at a point where something is just going to shift slightly.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
And I actually don't know what it is. So for those young, new people, you know, starting out on this, I think it's really important that you don't seek to just emulate, you don't seek to just do what's been done, because you'll find yourself in the position of the sort of 20-something travel writers in 1998 who got a book commissioned. They were like, I'm off, I'm up and away. And there are loads of them. You can identify them if you look back. Books that did quite well and got well received in 98, 99, and those people vanished. Whereas 10 years earlier, the people I keep mentioning, William Dalrymple, Philip Marsden, Sarah Wheeler, those were those people in 1990, and they had sustained careers because they got 10 solid years of travel writing, and then they were able to they had that position that allowed them big history books for William Dalrymple, stuff that kind of shaded into the nature and landscape stuff for Philip Marsden and so on. But there's a whole heap of travel writers, young travel writers, 98, 99, one big book, reviewed everywhere, gone, because the genre was on the down then. So I feel that we're probably at that point with the nature writing now. So if you are a young, or doesn't need to be young, a first-time writer working in this field, you need to find something different. And that's not for me to say. I'm kind of I'm in the middle generation now, so I'm going to just keep plodding on. But people who are at that start point,
my ears are wide open this, because I'm just going through this process right now myself, and I think it's a really good point. We'll have to end the conversation there in terms of questions, but I think it's a really good point for us in the book club to kind of keep our eyes out for what is new, what are the new voices. We're trying to mix in, Tim, in the future. We're going non-fiction and fiction with a sense of place or sense of history. So we're reading A Little Trickery by Rosanna Pike, set in late medieval England this month, and we'll have to see if we can get her on a YouTube live. But Tim, thank you so much, and apologies I couldn't get to all the questions and comments. I just had too many and too much to discuss, but it's been a real pleasure, and it's really added to mine and Agat's understanding of Cornwall, for sure. And I've heard from so many people the same. So it's really appreciated. And thanks everyone for joining as well. If you want to say thank you in the chat, I'll just leave it open another couple of minutes as well.
Thanks everyone. Brilliant conversation, Luke, and thanks to everyone for the questions. They were coming to me via Luke. I didn't have the YouTube bit open, so I couldn't see them. But thanks. I'm disappearing into the dark here. I'm to go near a light section.
It's coming out there. And apologies for my camera faux pas. I was all too relaxed, Tim, before, but never mind. These things happen.
I know. Yeah. I can spill the beans. Everyone who's still there. Luke was very casual about his low battery life coming in. Oh, it'll be fine. 33%. Everything will be fine.
I thought the cameras would just flick over. That was the thing. I just thought I'd use my good camera whilst I had it, and then it flicked over. And because I was trying to field the questions and do this at the same time, my mind was kind of a bit scrambled. So Agat came to save me. So, lesson learned.
It was fine. We could hear you anyway, so there was no problem at all.
And there was no swearing either. So that was a good thing. Oh well, there's so many nice comments. Right, Tim, feel free to sign off. I will end the stream, and hopefully this will go into YouTube world forevermore. But let's see. Okay, cheers, Tim.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.